Hello everyone, and welcome back to Boss Economic World. I'm your host, your guide through the financial jungle, and the guy who reads the footnotes so you don't have to. Today is December 16th, 2025. Grab your coffee or perhaps something stronger, considering the yield curve lately. Today we are looking at a story that sounds boring on the surface, but is actually a seismic shift in how the global economy is run. It's a story about power, ghosts, and the United States taking the ball and going home. Washington is about to take the chair of the G-20. And let me tell you, the Trump administration isn't just rearranging the furniture, they are selling the house. Let's peel this onion. Here is the news that dropped this morning from people familiar with the matter. The United States plans to slash the number of G20 finance meetings next year. For decades, the rhythm of the G20 has been predictable. It's a traveling circus. The finance ministers and central bank governors, the masters of the universe, typically meet 4 times a year. Twice in the host country, and twice on the sidelines of the IMF and World Bank meetings in D.C. It's a lot of shrimp cocktails, a lot of family photos, and a lot of jet fuel. But Uncle Sam, now back under the management of Donald Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, has looked at the schedule for 2026 and said, pass. Specifically, the US is canceling the traditional February meeting for finance ministers. Instead of the big gun showing up, the White House says a meeting will still happen, but only 4 deputy finance ministers. Friends, in the world of diplomacy, that is not a scheduling conflict. That is a slap in the face. It's like inviting your neighbors to a dinner party but sending your teenager to answer the door while you watch TV in the basement. The US intends to hold only one host nation session with the actual finance ministers and central bankers, scheduled for August. The official excuse? To tighten the schedule and free up time for deeper discussions. Translation: we are tired of listening to you. Now, why would the world's largest economy want to gut the world's premier economic forum? To understand this, we have to look at the last 3 years. You see, the G20 isn't what it used to be. Back in 2008, when the world was melting down, the G20 was the board of directors for Earth. They coordinated stimulus, they saved the banks, they stopped a depression. It was the original Avengers of finance. But look at who has hosted the last 3 years: South Africa, Brazil, and India. This was the era of the global South. And what did they want to talk about? They didn't want to talk about American interest rates or deregulation. They wanted to talk about debt restructuring, climate finance, and inequality. Legitimate topics? Absolutely. But for a Wall Street veteran like Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and a bilateral deal lover like President Trump, these meetings became agonizing. They turned into grievance sessions where the developing world asked the developed world for money, and the developed world pretended to listen while checking their iPhones. The data backs this up. Look at the communiques from the last 3 years. The word count for climate change and sustainable development skyrocketed by 400% compared to the 2019 Osaka summit. Meanwhile, concrete policy coordination on inflation or currency stability? Almost zero. The Trump administration is looking at this and saying, we are returning to the core mission. They stated explicitly that their priority for the 2026 presidency is delivering economic growth and prosperity and, wait for it, the reduction of regulatory burdens. This is key. The US doesn't want to talk about how to tax billionaires to save the rainforest. They want to talk about how to slash Basel III banking regulations, how to unleash crypto, and how to get the global economy growing by cutting red tape. And they know that if they hold 4 meetings, 3 of them will get hijacked by arguments about who pays for the green transition. So, the solution? Don't hold the meetings. This didn't happen overnight. We should have seen this coming. Remember last month? November 2025. The G20 summit in Johannesburg. President Trump pulled a move that would make a moody teenager proud. He skipped it. He didn't go. The leader of the free world, the biggest economy on the planet, left the seat empty. The group issued a communique anyway, but let's be honest, a G20 statement without the US signature is just a wish list. It underscored how little weight Washington now places on this forum. And it wasn't just Trump. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been playing hard to get all year. He didn't go to the finance gatherings in South Africa in February or July. He only showed up when the meetings were in his own backyard in Washington. This is a deliberate strategy. It's what I call strategic absenteeism. By starving the multilateral beast, the US forces countries to come to Washington one by one. You see, President Trump hates sitting at a roundtable with 19 other people, half of whom are criticizing American trade policy. He loves sitting across a small desk from one person. You want a trade deal? Come to the Oval Office. You want currency support? Call Bessent. By killing the G20 schedule, the US is effectively saying, multilateralism is dead. Long live bilateralism. There is another reason the US is pulling the plug on these meetings, and it's the elephant in the room we can't ignore: war. For the last 3 years, G20 finance ministers' meetings have been absolute chaos. You have the G7 countries on one side, and Russia and China on the other. Since the invasion of Ukraine and the flaring violence in the Middle East, finance meetings stopped being about finance. They became geopolitical shouting matches. The family photo was cancelled because nobody wanted to stand next to the Russian delegate. The final statements were often blocked because they couldn't agree on the word condemn. Imagine trying to discuss global interest rate harmonization when the guy across the table is accusing you of financing a war against him. It's awkward. By reducing the meetings, the US is trying to bypass the deadlock. If you can't agree on a joint statement because of Russia, stop trying to write joint statements. The US logic is, if we meet in February, we spend 3 days fighting about a paragraph on Ukraine. If we don't meet, we save the jet fuel. Okay, enough politics. What does this mean for the markets? What does it mean for you? 1. The deregulation super-cycle is coming. The US stated its goal is reducing regulatory burdens. With the US chairing the G-20, even if they hold fewer meetings, they set the agenda. Expect a massive push in 2026 to roll back global financial regulations. The Basel endgame capital requirements for banks? The US is going to try to water them down globally. This is bullish for US financials and global banks. If the US stops enforcing strict capital rules, banks lend more, buy back more stock, and profits go up. 2. The dollar remains king. By shifting to bilateral talks, the US leverages its power. In a group setting, Brazil and China can gang up on the dollar. One-on-one? Not so much. The de-dollarization narrative takes a hit. If you want to do business in 2026, you have to go through Washington, and you have to do it on their terms. Don't bet against the greenback just yet. 3. Emerging markets get the cold shoulder. The global south is going to be furious. They spent 3 years building a platform to discuss debt relief for poor nations. The US just turned off the microphone. Volatility in emerging market debt. Without G20 coordination on debt restructuring, countries in distress might find it harder to get bailouts. The IMF will be the only game in town, and the US controls the IMF. 4. Efficiency over consensus. Market professionals might actually secretly love this. The G20 had become a talking shop. By stripping it down to macroeconomics only and one meeting a year, the US might actually force the group to focus on the things that move markets: inflation, AI productivity, and trade flows. I prefer a rude meeting that gets something done over a polite meeting that produces a 50-page PDF nobody reads. We need to talk about Scott Bessent. He's not a politician, he's a hedge fund manager. He thinks like a trader. To a trader, time is money. A 2-day summit in Rio de Janeiro discussing social equity and finance has a negative ROI for the US Treasury. Bessent knows that the global economy in 2026 is facing a divergence. The US economy is roaring on the back of AI and deregulation, while Europe is stagnating and China is dealing with deflation. The Bessent Doctrine is simple: the US is the locomotive. Everyone else is a passenger. We don't need a committee meeting to tell the locomotive where to go. We just need to clear the tracks. This move to cut the February meeting is the first implementation of that doctrine. It is an aggressive, somewhat arrogant, but undeniable assertion of American exceptionalism. So, here is the wrap-up. Washington is taking over the G20, and their first act is to cancel the show. They are replacing the kumbaya of the Global South presidency with the art of the deal of the Trump presidency. We are moving from an era of complex multilateralism to ruthless efficiency. For the diplomats in Brussels and the UN, this is a nightmare. They lose their stage. For the traders on Wall Street, this is clarity. The noise is being filtered out. The US is betting that the world needs American growth more than it needs American politeness. They are probably right. But be warned, when you stop talking to your neighbors, you stop hearing them sharpen their knives. The G20 isn't dead, but it has been put on a severe diet. And in 2026, the menu is strictly burgers, deregulation, and the US dollar. As we watch this unfold, remember the golden rule of Boss Economic World: don't listen to what they say in the press release, watch who shows up to the meeting. And next February? Nobody is showing up. I'm your host, signing off. Keep your portfolio diversified and your passport ready, because the world just got a little more fragmented. See you next time.